I want you to imagine a world-famous detective. Let's call him, Medlock Holmes.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right. And picture him stepping past the yellow caution tape, ducking under the barrier, and walking into the ultimate crime scene.
But I'm guessing this isn't a dimly lit alleyway in Victorian London.
No, definitely not. It's the bustling, fluorescent-lit floor of a modern hospital ward. Or, maybe a sun-baked agricultural field. Or even a sleek, glass-walled office tower.
And our detective isn't searching for a murderer holding a conventional weapon, right? There's no smoking gun here.
Exactly. The culprits in this environment are entirely silent, they're often completely invisible, and they are incredibly patient.
Because Holmes is looking for chemical fumes suspended in the ambient air, or maybe he's analyzing the repetitive biomechanical strain of an assembly line.
Yeah, he's swabbing stainless steel surfaces for biological pathogens. Or he's interviewing the staff to measure the really crushing, insidious weight of psychosocial stress.
It's a fundamentally different kind of investigation than traditional clinical medicine. But the casualties are just as real, and honestly, the mortality rate is staggering.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission is to map the environment where you and, well, roughly half the global population spend about 40% of your waking hours.
We are exploring the intricate, often hidden world of occupational health.
Right. And for those of you reading along, we are using Chapter 7.4 of the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health as our primary structural spine today.
And we're going to build clear conceptual frameworks here, tracing the exact path from risk to exposure to outcome to intervention.
Because whether you are a medical student preparing for boards, a public health trainee, or, a practicing clinician seeing 30 patients a day, mastering this material isn't just academic.
No, it's about learning to see the hidden variables. It's about recognizing the environmental factors impacting every single patient that walks into your clinic.
So, to understand how we investigate the modern workplace, I think it helps to look at the very first clinician who started asking the right questions.
The original occupational detective.
Exactly, working way back in the year 1700.
Right, the Italian physician Bernardino Ramazzini. He published this seminal text called De Morbis Artificum Diatriba, which basically translates to Diseases of Workers.
And what really stands out about Ramazzini is how he completely altered the standard medical interview.
Yeah, he really did. I mean, doctors are fundamentally trained in the Hippocratic method, right? You sit down with a patient and you ask a very specific set of biological questions.
Like, what sort of pain do you have? When did it start? Are your bowels working normally? What are you eating?
Right, but Ramazzini looked at that established diagnostic sequence and realized it was missing the most crucial environmental context of a person's life.
He just added one vital question to the list. What occupation does he follow?
And by doing that, Ramazzini shifted the entire diagnostic lens from purely internal biology to the external environment.
Because he recognized that a baker breathing in flour dust all day, or, say, a miner inhaling rock particulates, would present with pathologies directly tied to how they earned their living.
It seems so obvious to us now.
It does, but it was revolutionary at the time. And it forces us to ask a really difficult question of modern clinical practice. Are we still failing to ask Ramazzini's question today?
That's the million-dollar question. When a patient comes in with a persistent cough or chronic back pain, how often do we actually dig into the specific mechanical and chemical realities of their workday?
The clinical data suggests we miss it a lot. We treat the symptom but completely ignore the source.
Yeah, and to appreciate why Ramazzini's question eventually became the foundation of global labor laws, we have to look at the massive societal shift that occurred shortly after his time.
The Industrial Revolution.
Exactly, the Industrial Revolution. Because before the 18th century, work was predominantly rural.
Right, you had cottage industries, farmers, craftsmen working out of small village shops or their own homes. The hazards were there, but they were localized.
They were small scale. But the Industrial Revolution was this profound biological and social shock to the human species. It took those rural populations and concentrated them into urban factories.
It wasn't just a change in location, it was a total disruption of human circadian rhythms, social structures, and biomechanics. People went from working by the sun to working by the factory whistle.
And inside those factories, workers faced completely uncontrolled hazards. I mean, you had massive machines with no safety guards leading to catastrophic amputation rates.
Unbelievable trauma.
And enclosed spaces with zero ventilation, concentrating toxic fumes and combustible dust. And of course, it introduced widespread child labor on an industrial scale.
Right. Children working 12 to 14 hours a day in textile mills and coal mines. It was essentially an uncontrolled, population-level biological experiment on the working class.
It really was. And the sheer scale of the morbidity and mortality eventually forced a legislative response. The public health crisis was just too large to ignore.
So reformers and early epidemiologists began linking factory conditions to massive outbreaks of infectious diseases and chronic injuries.
Which gave birth to early health and labor legislation. Those early, hard-fought battles set the historical momentum for the modern legal frameworks we rely on globally today.
We're talking about institutions like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, created in the U.S. in 1970, and the Health and Safety at Work Act passed in the U.K. in 1974.
And these frameworks fundamentally shifted the burden. They established that employers have a legal duty to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards.
So we have the legislation now, but we really need to look at the actual epidemiological data to understand the scale of the problem today.
Right. And according to the International Labor Organization's data, frequently cited in the 2008 models, there are roughly 2.34 million work-related deaths annually.
Over 2 million deaths every single year. That is a staggering public health burden.
It is. And the most critical distinction in that data is the mechanism of death. Of those 2.34 million fatalities, 2.02 million are from diseases, not accidents.
That completely flips the common perception. I mean, when we think of occupational hazards, the mind immediately goes to acute trauma, right?
Right. A fall from scaffolding, a trench collapse, some catastrophic machinery malfunction.
But the data shows the vast majority of casualties are the result of slow, chronic exposures, the invisible culprits.
Breaking down that mortality burden really reveals the systemic nature of the problem. Roughly 29% of those deaths are due to malignant neoplasms.
Occupational cancers.
Exactly. Another 25% are communicable diseases, often contracted in healthcare or agricultural settings. And 21% are circulatory diseases, heavily linked to the physiological strain and stress of the work environment.
So to properly map these illnesses, we need to establish a very firm diagnostic framework here. The textbook makes a sharp, vital distinction between an occupational disease and a work-related disease.
And for the clinicians and students listening, mastering this differentiation is crucial. It impacts diagnosis, and it heavily impacts workers' compensation.
So let's break it down. What defines an occupational disease?
An occupational disease is defined by a clear, direct, and primary causal relationship with a specific workplace hazard. The pathology would almost certainly not exist without that specific exposure.
The classic example being silicosis in a stonemason or a sandblaster.
Yes, perfectly. If that individual had not spent years inhaling microscopic silica dust on the job, they would not have developed silicosis. The line from hazard to disease is direct.
But a work-related disease casts a much wider net, doesn't it?
It does. In a work-related disease, the occupational environment is a contributing factor, sometimes a very significant one, but it is multifactorial. The disease have other distinct etiologies.
So we're talking about conditions like essential hypertension or chronic lower back pain.
Right. Consider a warehouse worker with severe lumbar disc degeneration. The constant lifting and twisting at work undeniably aggravated the condition, maybe even accelerated it.
But that worker's age, their genetic predisposition, their body mass index, and outside activities also play a major role.
Exactly. You cannot entirely cure or prevent a work-related disease solely by fixing the workplace, whereas eliminating the silica completely prevents the occupational disease of silicosis.
That framework gives us the perfect lens to start investigating the actual hazards. Let's examine the specific chemical and physical suspects, moving system by system.
Sounds good.
And the most accessible, vulnerable target organ for any airborne hazard has to be the human respiratory system.
Oh, absolutely. The lungs are highly vulnerable just due to their massive surface area. We are talking about roughly 50 to 75 square meters of delicate alveolar tissue.
Just in direct, continuous interface with the ambient environment.
Right. And the major category of chronic occupational lung disease is the pneumoconiosis, which translates to the dust diseases of the lungs.
And the most prevalent of those globally is silicosis.
Yeah, silicosis affects miners, millers, foundry workers, anyone cutting stone or concrete. And to understand the pathology, we have to look at the cellular level.
Let's do it. What happens when crystalline silica is inhaled?
Well, when it's inhaled deep into the alveoli, The body's immune system sends alveolar macrophages to engulf and clear the foreign particle.
Sort of the cellular cleanup crew.
Exactly. But silica is highly toxic to these macrophages. So the macrophage engulfs the silica dust, but then the dust ruptures the macrophage's lysosomes.
Oh, wow. So the immune cell just dies?
It dies, and it releases the silica back into the lung tissue, along with
The dead macrophage summons more macrophages, which also die.
creating a continuous cycle of inflammation that eventually lays down thick, irreversible scar tissue, fibrosis.
The textbook anchors this with a really profound historical tragedy, the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia during the early 1930s.
Such a dark chapter. Workers were tasked with drilling a 3-mile hydroelectric tunnel through rock that was exceptionally high in pure silica.
And they were doing this in enclosed spaces, often without basic dust suppression techniques like wet drilling, and absolutely without adequate respiratory protection.
The exposure levels were so astronomically high that workers developed acute silicosis, which is a rapidly progressive and fatal form of the disease.
Hundreds of men died, many within months of their initial exposure.
It remains one of the worst industrial disasters in United States history, and it really highlights the devastating potential of uncontrolled acute exposure.
While silicosis is driven by dust, the respiratory system is also the primary site for one of the most insidious, legally contentious occupational threats of the last century: asbestos.
Right, asbestos. It's a naturally occurring fibrous silicate mineral. And because it is highly resistant to heat, electricity, and chemical corrosion, it was deemed this miracle material.
It was woven into everything, wasn't it? Ship insulation, brake pads, building materials.
Everywhere. And now it is responsible for over 100,000 deaths globally every single year.
But the real public health challenge with asbestos isn't just its toxicity, it's the mechanism of latency.
Yes, latency is the key here. Asbestos fibers are microscopic and aerodynamic. When inhaled, they bypass the upper respiratory defenses and lodge deep in the pulmonary parenchyma.
And the pleural lining of the lungs.
Right. And much like silica, they cannot be easily degraded by the body's immune cells.
So it's essentially a biological time bomb. The fibers just sit in the tissue, causing chronic, low-grade cellular damage.
They generate reactive oxygen species, and they physically interfere with chromosome segregation during cell division.
And the subtle, continuous damage takes decades to manifest clinically, right?
Decades. A shipyard worker exposed to asbestos in 1980 might not develop asbestosis, lung cancer, or mesothelioma, that highly aggressive pleural cancer, until 2010 or 2020.
Which requires a very specific type of systems thinking from public health officials. I mean, even in countries that have completely banned all use and importation of asbestos today, the mortality curve won't drop immediately.
No, the fuse was lit decades ago for millions of workers. We will be managing the clinical fallout of mid-20th century industrial practices for decades into the future.
Now, beyond fibrotic diseases and cancers, we also have to consider the widespread burden of occupational asthma.
Oh, definitely. More than 10% of the adult population in developed countries has bronchial asthma. And epidemiological estimates suggest that 10 to 25% of new-onset adult asthma is entirely work-related.
A quarter of new adult asthma cases originate in the workplace. That's huge. We are talking about bakers reacting to flour dust, automotive painters reacting to isocyanates, or cleaners reacting to industrial detergents.
The chemical acts as an antigen. It sensitizes the immune system so that subsequent exposures trigger severe bronchospasm.
And the Oxford text points out a fascinating epidemiological challenge regarding how we actually measure the prevalence of occupational
A
asthma.
healthy worker survivor effect.
Yes, the data we collect at the worksite often vastly underestimates the true burden because of this effect. Let's walk through the logic of that for everyone listening.
Sure. If a worker develops severe asthma from inhaling a chemical sensitizer on the assembly line, their daily life becomes physically unbearable. They
Yeah.
cannot breathe.
So they do the most logical thing. They quit the job.
Right. They leave the hazardous environment, and they take their damaged lungs and their asthma diagnosis with them into the general population pool.
So when an occupational health epidemiologist surveys that specific factory floor to measure the prevalence of asthma, they only find the survivors.
The workers whose immune systems happen to tolerate the chemical environment.
So the prevalence at the worksite looks artificially low, perhaps even normal, while the true occupational burden is hidden away in community primary care
It's
clinics.
a massive blind spot.
Okay, so we have mapped the internal surface area, the lungs, but the body's largest organ is fully exposed to the ambient environment at all times, the skin.
The skin is a massive surface area and a primary boundary against environmental toxins. Irritant contact dermatitis is incredibly prevalent. We see this constantly.
In florists, hairdressers, metal workers, maintenance personnel.
Yeah, it is a mechanical and chemical breakdown of the barrier. Constant exposure to water, harsh alkaline soaps, solvents, and industrial cutting fluids strips away the skin's protective lipid layer.
The stratum corneum breaks down, leading to chronic inflammation, fissuring, and secondary bacterial infections.
And moving beyond localized inflammation, we must address occupational cancer. The data indicates that occupational exposures account for between 4 and 20% of all cancers in developed nations.
That is a really wide statistical range, 4 to 20%.
It is, and the range exists because population data includes children and the elderly. However, if you restrict the epidemiological focus specifically to the adult population, which is where occupational exposure almost exclusively occurs, the proportion of cancer attributed to the workplace can rise to 20% among those heavily exposed.
Think about what that actually means. We spend massive amounts of public health funding warning people about the carcinogenic risks of tobacco, UV sunlight, processed meats.
Right, the well-known risks.
Yet, up to a fifth of adult cancers in exposed populations are coming from the chemicals they are handed at work. Why is this not causing a daily public outcry? Why are these chemical hazards flying under the radar?
Well, the under-recognition of occupational disease represents a profound, multi-layered failure of systemic detection. There are 4 primary drivers behind this blind spot.
Let's go through them. What's the first?
The first is clinical masquerade. The disease lacks a unique signature.
So it just looks like an everyday, non-occupational disease.
Exactly. Most occupational diseases look exactly like standard illnesses.
Wow.
Let's look at polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, found in industrial pitch, tar, and silt.
PAHs are highly mutagenic. They bind directly to DNA, forming adducts that lead to cellular mutation.
Right. But if a worker handling tar develops a squamous cell carcinoma on their arm, a dermatologist is highly likely to view it as a result of cumulative sun exposure.
Because there is no chemical stamp on the tumor that says caused by PAHs?
Exactly. Another classic example is solvent-induced encephalopathy. Many industrial degreasers and solvents are highly lipophilic, meaning they dissolve easily in fats.
And because the human brain is largely composed of lipid-rich tissue, these solvents readily cross the blood-brain barrier.
Right, so decades of inhaling these lipophilic solvents causes chronic central nervous system damage. But when a 65-year-old retired machinist presents to a clinic with memory loss, cognitive decline, and mood disturbances, what happens?
The attending physician typically diagnoses early-onset dementia or normal age-related cognitive decline. The occupational etiology is completely missed.
It's invisible.
Okay, what is the second reason for this under-recognition?
The reality of the uncontrolled chemical experiment. There are currently over 80,000 chemicals used in commercial industry. Only a tiny fraction of them have undergone comprehensive toxicity screening.
So we are inventing and deploying chemicals faster than we can study their biological interactions.
Way faster. And even when chemicals are tested, regulatory frameworks often prioritize identifying acute toxicity. How much dose causes immediate death or obvious aggressive cancer risks.
We rarely fund long-term studies to look for subtle neurological degradation, slight immunological suppression, or complex reproductive effects.
We largely just do not know the full biological profile of the substances workers handle daily.
That's terrifying. The third driver brings us back to Ramazzini, doesn't it? It is a fundamental gap in medical education.
Yeah, medical school curricula are intensely crowded. With the explosion of knowledge in genetics, advanced pharmacology, and novel imaging modalities, academic institutions are allocating progressively less time to environmental and occupational medicine.
Clinicians simply do not have the training or the time in a standard 15-minute consultation to take a granular occupational history.
They don't. And the fourth driver is perhaps the most difficult to overcome because it involves structural economics, conflict of interest.
Right, because linking a chronic disease directly to a workplace environment carries massive financial and legal liability.
Employers who possess the most accurate data regarding chemical usage and atmospheric concentrations have a powerful systemic disincentive to formally recognize that their processes are generating disease.
Especially when the clinical picture is muddied by personal factors. I mean, if a worker who smoked a pack of cigarettes a day for 20 years develops lung cancer, it is incredibly difficult to legally prove that the ambient chemical fumes on the factory floor were the primary driver.
Even if those fumes are known carcinogens, the burden of proof falls on the worker, and the epidemiological water is permanently muddy.
So we have spent considerable time on chemical and physical hazards, the things that come in barrels with warning labels. But the modern workplace is evolving.
It is. We must categorize the silent threats that do not behave like traditional toxins. We need to look at biological, reproductive, and psychosocial hazards.
Let's examine biological hazards first. These are a primary concern, particularly for those of us in the health professions.
Oh, absolutely. Healthcare workers face continuous biological risk profiles: hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV transmission via percutaneous needle stick injuries.
And the threat matrix is always shifting. We are managing the reemergence of older, evolving pathogens like multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, alongside the sudden appearance of novel respiratory viruses.
The textbook highlights a great example here: the 2003 global outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS.
The epidemiological data from that 2003 SARS outbreak perfectly illustrates the concept of occupational vulnerability in healthcare.
Globally, 20% of all individuals who contracted SARS were healthcare workers. They were the frontline barrier, and they absorbed a massive proportion of the biological impact.
But biological hazards extend far beyond the sterile environment of a hospital. Agricultural and veterinary workers face zoonosis diseases transmitted from animals to humans.
A classic example is leptospirosis, which is bacterial infection spread through water contaminated by animal urine. It heavily affects farmers and abattoir workers.
Additionally, outdoor workers in endemic regions face severe risks from vector-borne diseases like malaria or dengue fever.
Now, beyond infectious agents, we must consider reproductive hazards. And these are particularly insidious because they extend the occupational damage to the next generation.
We have clear data on heavy metals like lead or agricultural pesticides like DBCP causing severe gonadal toxicity and drastically lowering sperm counts in male workers.
And in female workers, exposure to specific industrial solvents or ionizing radiation can induce menstrual irregularities, primary infertility, and devastating teratogenic effects.
Structural abnormalities in the developing fetus if exposure occurs during pregnancy.
Right. We also face chronic physical hazards, the most prevalent being noise. Noise-induced hearing loss, or NIHL, is a global epidemic.
It affects tens of millions of workers in manufacturing, construction, and military sectors. And we need to be clear, this isn't just a natural consequence of aging. This is mechanical destruction.
Yes, the constant bombardment of high-decibel sound waves physically shears and destroys the delicate sensory hair cells, the stereocilia within the cochlea of the inner ear.
And once those cells are destroyed, they do not regenerate. The hearing loss is permanent and irreversible.
However, the most profound shift in occupational health in post-industrial nations over the last few decades hasn't been chemical or infectious.
Right, as we have improved ventilation and enclosed noisy machinery, a new epidemic has emerged: biomechanical failure and psychosocial stress.
Musculoskeletal disorders, chronic lower back pain, carpal tunnel syndrome, cervical neck strain now account for an astonishing 34% of all days away from work in the United States.
We have transitioned from an era defined by chemical burns and crushing injuries to one defined by repetitive microtrauma and psychological burnout.
And the psychological component is critical. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, defines job stress very specifically.
How do they define it?
They define it as the harmful physical and emotional responses that occur when the requirements of the job do not match the capabilities, resources, or needs of the worker.
So it is a fundamental mismatch between demand and capacity. And current survey data indicates that roughly 25% of employees view their job as the single greatest stressor in their entire lives.
And to understand the public health implication, we must translate stress from a subjective feeling into a physiological mechanism.
Right. Chronic workplace, stress driven by high demands, low autonomy, lack of administrative support, or sheer workload triggers a sustained neuroendocrine response.
The body essentially perceives the workplace as a continuous threat.
The brain signals the adrenal glands to constantly pump out cortisol and adrenaline. The sympathetic nervous system remains locked in overdrive.
And this chronic state of hyperarousal damages the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, leading to hypertension and a markedly increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
It suppresses immune function, making the worker more susceptible to infections. It disrupts gastric acid regulation, manifesting clinically as peptic ulcers or irritable bowel syndrome.
The workplace environment literally rewires the worker's physiological baseline. It converts a psychosocial exposure into a measurable, often fatal, clinical disease.
This systemic overview of hazards leads us to a really critical realization about distribution. These hazards, whether we are talking about silica dust, biological pathogens, or psychosocial burnout, do not distribute themselves equally across the population.
Not at all. The workplace is a mirror reflecting global socioeconomic inequalities.
We have to ask, who bears the highest burden of exposure? The data points overwhelmingly to the developing world, which currently houses roughly 80% of the global workforce.
And policymakers in developing nations are frequently trapped in a brutal macroeconomic paradox. They desperately need rapid industrial development to elevate their populations out of poverty.
However, attracting the necessary foreign investment in multinational manufacturing often requires them to offer low-cost labor and enforce incredibly weak or entirely absent environmental and labor protections.
It creates a global race to the bottom for occupational safety. And the textbook highlights a massive structural blind spot in this equation, the informal sector.
The informal sector consists of unregistered, unrecognized, and largely untaxed economic activities. We are talking about home-based manufacturing, street vending, unregulated textile assembly, and informal waste scavenging.
Because these enterprises do not legally exist on paper, they operate in a regulatory black hole. There are no occupational safety standards, no government inspections, and absolutely no legal recourse or compensation for injured workers.
And the sheer volume of humanity operating in this sector is staggering. The data shows that the informal sector accounts for up to 75% of all non-agricultural employment in sub-Saharan Africa.
In nations like India and Indonesia, it encompasses up to 90% of women working in non-agricultural roles.
Which brings us to another highly vulnerable demographic, child labor. The International Labor Organization estimates there are over 215 million child workers globally, frequently engaged in agriculture, mining, and informal manufacturing.
In clinical medicine, we are trained to recognize that children are not just miniature adults. Their physiology is entirely different.
You would never prescribe an adult dose of a potent medication to a 10-year-old, yet the global economy routinely forces children into adult work environments.
The biological mismatch is severe. Children have a higher surface area to mass ratio, meaning their bodies absorb environmental chemicals through the skin much faster than adults.
Their cells are undergoing rapid division, making them vastly more susceptible to genetic damage from mutagens and carcinogens.
And from a purely mechanical perspective, handing a child adult-sized tools or expecting them to operate adult-scale machinery causes rapid biomechanical fatigue, bone deformities, and catastrophic traumatic injuries.
Furthermore, standard personal protective equipment like an adult-sized respirator or safety goggles completely fails to seal or protect a child's face.
Women also face distinct systemic occupational vulnerabilities, comprising about 42% of the global workforce. This vulnerability is heavily driven by occupational segregation.
Right. Women are structurally clustered into very specific, often undervalued sectors: nursing, teaching, textile manufacturing, domestic labor, and social services.
And each of these sectors carries specific hazard profiles, such as biological exposure in nursing or severe ergonomic strain in domestic labor.
But beyond the immediate workplace hazards, women universally face the dual burden of paid employment coupled with unpaid, culturally mandated caregiving roles at home,
which drastically compounds their cumulative physiological and psychosocial stress burden.
We also see intense vulnerability in migrant and expatriate workers. They are physically separated from their social support networks.
They face severe language barriers, meaning they cannot read chemical safety data sheets or comprehend complex safety protocols.
Crucially, they often lack secure legal status. A worker without legal documentation cannot report unsafe conditions, toxic exposures, or wage theft to regulatory authorities without risking immediate deportation.
They are structurally silenced, making them the ultimate targets for occupational exploitation. They also frequently live in crowded, substandard, temporary housing, bridging the gap between occupational hazards and community infectious disease outbreaks.
Now, the textbook introduces a spiralized vulnerability that affects workers across all socioeconomic levels, from the factory floor to the intensive care unit. Let's discuss shift workers.
This is a big one. Roughly 20% of the global workforce engages in irregular shifts or works more than 48 hours a week.
Operating outside of daylight hours requires profound physiological disruption. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IRRC, has classified shift work that involves circadian disruption as a Group 2A carcinogen.
That is a staggering classification. Working the night shift is officially recognized as a probable human carcinogen.
How does the simple act of staying awake at night cause cancer?
It comes down to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain and the production of melatonin. Melatonin is not just a sleep-inducing hormone. It is a potent antioxidant and an oncostatic or anti-cancer agent.
It scavenges free radicals and regulates cellular repair, and melatonin production is strictly controlled by light.
So when a nurse or a factory worker is under bright artificial fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning, their brain assumes it is daytime and shuts down melatonin synthesis.
And the suppression of melatonin alters the body's cellular repair mechanisms, deregulates the immune system's surveillance of mutated cells, and alters estrogen production.
The epidemiological data shows a clear link between long-term circadian disruption and an increased risk of breast cancer in female shift workers and prostate cancer in males.
We are forcing a diurnal species to operate nocturnally, and the biological cost is cellular mutation.
We have identified the vast array of hazards and the populations most vulnerable to them. But public health requires precision. How do we actually measure, quantify, and assess these threats?
The framework of investigation begins with a crucial differentiation that every public health professional and clinician must master: the fundamental difference between a hazard and a risk.
Let's clearly define the parameters. A hazard is the intrinsic, unchangeable potential of a substance, energy source, or situation to cause harm.
Right. A high-voltage power line is a hazard. A vat of hydrochloric acid is a hazard. A 120 decibel industrial generator is a hazard. The hazard simply exists.
Risk, however, is a mathematical and situational probability. Risk is the likelihood that the harm will actually occur, combined with the severity of the consequence. And risk is entirely dependent on exposure.
Think of it like a shark swimming in the middle of the ocean. The shark is a hazard. It has the intrinsic biological potential to inflict severe trauma. But if you are sitting in a lawn chair safely on the beach, your exposure is zero.
Therefore, your risk is zero. The hazard exists, but the risk is managed by distance.
Now, if you dive into the ocean with a piece of raw meat strapped to your leg, your risk becomes astronomically high. The hazard, the shark, did not change at all. Your exposure changed.
That is an excellent conceptual model. Occupational risk assessment requires measuring the magnitude of that exposure and deciding if the resulting risk is tolerable.
And tolerable does not mean perfectly safe, right?
Right. It means that society, the regulatory body, or the individual is willing to accept a highly controlled level of risk in order to secure the economic or societal benefits of the work.
To determine if an environment is tolerable, we must assess the exact level of exposure. The Public Health Toolkit divides this into environmental monitoring and biological monitoring. Let's start with environmental.
Environmental monitoring involves directly measuring the ambient workplace surroundings. We use air sampling pumps to draw the factory air through a filter, capturing chemical dust, vapors, or toxic gases.
We then send those filters to a lab to calculate the exact concentration of the toxin in the air.
And we compare those concentration levels against regulatory speed limits. Depending on the jurisdiction, these are called permissible exposure limits, or PLs, or threshold limit values, TLVs.
If the air concentration is below the TLV, the environment is legally deemed tolerable.
However, relying solely on environmental monitoring has severe public health limitations. A TLV is mathematically calculated assuming a standard healthy adult working a traditional 8-hour shift, with 16 hours of recovery time away from the chemical.
But the modern economy doesn't run on 8-hour shifts. If a worker is pulling a 12-hour or 14-hour shift, their exposure time increases and their cellular recovery time plummets. The 8-hour TLV standard completely fails to protect them.
Environmental monitoring also fails to account for the synergistic effects of inhaling 3 or 4 different chemicals simultaneously, which is very common in manufacturing.
Furthermore, for many known carcinogens, the scientific consensus is that there is absolutely no safe threshold of exposure. Any molecule inhaled increases the risk of mutation.
Because of the flaws in just measuring the air, occupational health physicians utilize biological monitoring.
Biological monitoring shifts the focus from the room to the worker. It involves taking biological samples directly from the employee, usually blood, urine, or exhaled breath, and measuring the exact concentration of the chemical toxin or its metabolic byproducts within their body.
And why is this clinically superior for the individual worker? because biological monitoring captures the true total body burden.
Environmental air monitoring makes a massive assumption. It assumes the only way the chemical enters the body is through the lungs. Biological monitoring captures all routes of entry.
Like percutaneous absorption. If a mechanic is washing parts in a lipophilic solvent, they might be absorbing massive amounts of the chemical directly through the skin of their hands.
An air monitor clipped to their collar will register zero exposure, but a urine test will reveal dangerously high levels of solvent metabolites.
Biological monitoring also captures extra-occupational exposures. For instance, if the worker uses similar toxic chemicals for a hobby in their unventilated garage over the weekend. We compare these total body results against biological exposure indices, or BEIs.
So, environmental and biological monitoring tell us how much chemical is inside the worker. But how do we assess the actual physiological damage? How do we measure the health effects?
We utilize two distinct clinical approaches: biological effect monitoring and health surveillance. Biological effect monitoring is the pursuit of early, reversible biochemical alterations.
We want to detect the chemical's interaction with the body before any clinical disease or permanent damage occurs. We are looking for the biological alarm bells.
A prime clinical example is measuring cholinesterase enzyme levels in agricultural workers who apply organophosphate pesticides. Organophosphates are highly neurotoxic.
They inhibit the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, causing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine to build up in the synaptic cleft, leading to uncontrolled nerve firing, a cholinergic crisis.
By routinely drawing blood and measuring the worker's baseline cholinesterase levels, we can detect if the enzyme activity is dropping.
If we see a 20 or 30% drop, it proves the pesticide is breaching their protective gear and binding to their nervous system, even if the worker feels perfectly fine and has no symptoms.
We can pull them out of the field, stop the exposure, and their enzyme levels will naturally regenerate over a few weeks. The intervention prevents the clinical disease, no permanent damage.
Health surveillance, on the other hand, involves periodic clinical examinations looking for early signs of actual physiological damage.
The classic example is performing annual audiometry hearing tests on workers in high-noise environments. We map their hearing thresholds to see if they are developing a high-frequency notch, indicating the early stages of permanent mechanical damage to the cochlea.
This brings us to the ultimate goal of public health. Detection and monitoring are completely meaningless if we do not use that data to intervene. We must engineer safety into the system.
The architecture of prevention in occupational health relies on a universally recognized, prioritized framework known as the hierarchy of controls. It's a gold standard for primary prevention.
The concept is simple. You start at the top, the most effective intervention, and only move down the list if the higher options are technologically or economically impossible. Level 1, the absolute pinnacle of safety: elimination or substitution.
You completely remove the hazard from the environment. You ban the use of asbestos in all building materials. Or, if you cannot eliminate the process, you substitute a highly toxic carcinogenic degreasing solvent with a water-based, non-toxic alternative.
The hazard is physically gone, therefore, the risk drops to zero. It is the only foolproof method. But let's say we are operating a rock quarry. You cannot eliminate silica dust. Cutting rock is the fundamental nature of the business.
Right, so you move to level 2. Engineering controls. This is upstream prevention. You fix the plumbing before the house floods.
Engineering controls physically alter the work environment to isolate the worker from the hazard. You install local exhaust ventilation systems, massive vacuums positioned directly over the saw blade to capture the silica dust using fluid dynamics before it can disperse into the ambient air.
You build a soundproof acoustic enclosure around the 120 decibel generator. You change the physical reality of the room.
Level 3 is redesign, which focuses heavily on ergonomics. You adjust the height of the conveyor belt so the worker isn't constantly flexing their lumbar spine. You install mechanical hoists to eliminate manual lifting.
If engineering and redesign are insufficient, we fall to level 4, administrative controls. This involves changing human behavior and policy. You implement mandatory job rotations so a worker only spends 2 hours in the noisy zone instead of 8.
You mandate strict rest periods in climate-controlled rooms for workers in extreme heat. But the critical public health distinction here is that administrative controls do absolutely nothing to reduce the intrinsic hazard.
The room is still 100 degrees. The machine is still deafening. You are solely manipulating the duration of the exposure.
Which is why it is lower on the hierarchy. It relies entirely on human compliance and perfect scheduling. And that brings us to the bottom of the hierarchy, the absolute last resort, level 5. Personal protective equipment, or PPE. Respirators, nitrile gloves, earplugs, lead aprons.
From a layman's perspective, this is a paradox. If PPE is officially recognized as the least effective, weakest line of defense, why is it the universal symbol of safety? Every construction site, every factory, it's an ocean of hard hats, safety glasses, and high-visibility vests.
PPE is ubiquitous because it is cheap. It requires no complex engineering or alteration of the manufacturing process, and crucially, from a corporate liability standpoint, it shifts the entire burden of compliance directly onto the worker.
It privatizes the safety responsibility. If a multi-million-dollar ventilation system fails, the corporation is clearly at fault. If a worker develops chemical burns while wearing a protective suit, the corporation can often argue that the worker failed to don the suit correctly or failed to inspect it for tears.
But biologically and mechanically, PPE is fundamentally flawed.
It fails at the point of human interface. If a worker has facial hair, a tight-fitting N95 respirator cannot form a seal, and the protection drops to zero.
If a worker is in a tropical agricultural environment, wearing a non-breathable Tyvek suit causes rapid hyperthermia and heat stroke. They will inevitably remove the suit to survive the heat, exposing themselves to the pesticide.
PPE must only be used as a temporary stopgap or an added layer of redundancy, never as the primary strategy.
That covers primary prevention, stopping the exposure before it happens. What about secondary and tertiary prevention?
Secondary prevention attempts to halt the progression of a disease that has already begun. This includes pre-employment baseline data collection and statutory periodic medical examinations. However, public health professionals must be deeply critical of how these exams are deployed.
The textbook highlights a massive historical failure regarding statutory exams, specifically chest x-rays for asbestos workers.
For decades, regulatory bodies and corporations mandated annual chest x-rays for workers exposed to asbestos, operating under the assumption that this constituted robust secondary prevention. The reality is that it was clinically useless for prevention.
Because of the latency period?
Exactly. By the time asbestos-induced fibrotic changes or pleural plaques are visible on a standard radiograph, the cellular damage is profound and completely irreversible. You haven't prevented the disease, you have merely documented the tragedy.
Relying on lagging clinical indicators instead of upstream source control is a failure of occupational health. Tertiary prevention is the final safety net. It is what happens after the disease or catastrophic injury is fully established.
It involves workers' compensation systems, medical rehabilitation, retraining programs, and large-scale emergency disaster planning.
As we conclude our mapping of the workplace, we must recognize a fundamental paradigm shift. The hard boundaries of our field are rapidly blurring. There is a profound, unavoidable convergence occurring between occupational health and environmental health.
Because the factory does not exist in a vacuum. The industrial processes that poison the worker inevitably bleed into the community.
The toxic heavy metals that a worker handles for 8 hours a day on the shift are the exact same heavy metals that are pumped out of the exhaust stack or dumped into the local river, exposing the surrounding community, including infants, the elderly, and the immunocompromised for 24 hours a day.
The workplace is the epicenter, the point source of community pollution. You cannot effectively separate the health of the worker from the health of the ecosystem they return to at the end of their shift.
Which is why the frameworks we've discussed today, monitoring, regulation, and the hierarchy of controls, are vital not just for labor, but for global public health survival. I want to leave everyone with a final thought experiment. We've spent this deep dive analyzing factories, hospitals, and construction sites, but the nature of work is fracturing.
As we rapidly transition into a gig economy and an era of remote work, the boundaries of the workplace have vanished.
If your kitchen table is the new corporate office and your smartphone is the new factory floor, who is legally and ethically responsible for your occupational health? Are we entering an era where digital burnout, chronic isolation, and extreme ergonomic strain in home offices become massive, completely untrackable public health epidemics? The crime scene Medlock Holmes is investigating just moved into our living rooms.
The decentralization of labor is the frontier that public health epidemiology must now figure out how to measure and regulate.
Let's summarize our core takeaways. Occupational exposures drive a massive burden of both acute trauma and chronic disease, heavily under-recognized due to clinical mimicry and long latency periods. The hierarchy of controls dictates that upstream engineering and substitution always trump personal protective equipment.
Exposure monitoring, particularly biological monitoring, is essential for capturing the true physiological burden. Psychosocial risk factors and circadian disruption are rapidly emerging threats, and structurally vulnerable populations continually face the highest exposures.
To lock in these concepts, we will now transition to a structured review. I will provide 5 rapid, single best answer clinical prompts. I will pause briefly after each question. Use that moment to solidify your reasoning. Prompt 1. A manufacturing facility decides to replace a highly toxic, volatile degreasing solvent with a newly developed, water-based, non-toxic alternative. According to the foundational frameworks of occupational health, which level of the hierarchy of controls does this action represent?
Take a second to think about it.
The answer is substitution.
Which is the most effective form of primary prevention, sitting at the very top of the hierarchy of controls alongside elimination.
Prompt 2. In the context of occupational epidemiology and safety assessments, what is the fundamental conceptual difference between a hazard and a risk?
Lock in your answer.
The answer is that a hazard is the intrinsic, unchangeable potential of an agent or situation to cause harm. Risk is the mathematical likelihood and consequence of that harm actually occurring, which is entirely dependent on the level of exposure.
Right, the shark analogy.
Prompt 3. An occupational health physician chooses to implement routine urine tests to measure solvent metabolites in factory workers rather than relying solely on ambient air monitors. Why is biological monitoring often preferred over environmental monitoring in this specific context?
Think about the routes of entry.
The answer is that biological monitoring accounts for the total body burden. It captures all potential routes of entry, specifically percutaneous or skin absorption, which air monitors miss entirely, as well as accounting for individual metabolic differences and extra occupational exposures.
Moving on to prompt 4. Based on extensive epidemiological data regarding cellular repair and melatonin suppression, the International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified shift work that involves circadian disruption as what?
Just take a moment.
The answer is a probable human carcinogen, designated as Group 2A.
And finally, prompt 5. Why are annual mandatory chest x-rays considered a fundamentally ineffective secondary prevention tool for workers exposed to asbestos?
Consider the timeline of the disease.
The answer is due to the extreme latency period of asbestos-related pathophysiology. By the time radiological changes, such as pleural plaques or fibrosis, are visible, profound and irreversible cellular damage has already occurred, rendering the intervention incapable of altering the disease trajectory.
To consolidate these frameworks and deepen your clinical reasoning, please revisit the specific sections on assessing the risk of work and managing the risk of work in Chapter 7.4 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
Here are the details of this episode.
Occupational health. Byline. Work and well-being, protecting health in the environments where people earn their living.